Hi there. I would like to start this TED Talk off by opening up the question to the audience. How many orchid species do you think are in the world? Anybody?
Over 500.
44? 100? Couple more?
1,000?
Good
10,000.
guesses. 100. Hotter.
Millions.
So there are actually over 30,000 wild species and 70,000 hybrids. So I think Kyle was the closest. 100,000, close to a little over 100,000. All right. So considering the fact that there's over 100,000 orchids, I kind of came to the conclusion that they must have a very high reproductive success rate. I kind of thought about that, and that led me to my research question. How do you successfully breed orchids? Today I'm going to try and do my best to answer this question throughout my TED Talk, and yeah. So there were kind of three main areas of research I looked at during this research time. There's orchid cloning, which is like taking one plant, taking certain parts of their stems that they bloom off of, chopping those up, getting to certain places, and like propagating them basically, so creating an identical clone of that orchid that you have with you. Then there's orchid hybridization, which will be like taking two different flowers, cross-pollinating them, and like getting different traits, or getting a different plant with traits from both parent plants. You go about doing that by taking two flowers. They have like male and female parts, so the orchids, they're hermaphrodites. They have what's called an anther cap up here, which protects like their two pollen glands called pollinia. And then down in this center area of the plant, they have what's called the stigmatic surface, which is basically their female reproductive organ. So you do only need one plant to reproduce, one flower. You could take the stigma off this one, anther off this one, put the pollen down there in the stigma, and it will fertilize the plant. With the hybridization, again, you're taking two completely different plants and hoping to get your own. The third one, which is kind of just touched on, was pollination in nature and at home. So like a big part of my research was looking at a specific species, Bulbophyllum, which is, this is Bulbophyllum futium, I believe is how you pronounce that one. So I looked at this species and like the lip structure and the anatomy, reproductive anatomy, and how they reproduce in the wild, which was with flies and wind. So they've got this little bell thing here that kind of jingles in the wind, attracts flies, brings them in. They land there, it's on a little tilt, so flies crawl back into the center of the flower, it tilts, they get the anther cap on their back, and then they are slowly pushed kind of deeper down in the flower where that stigma is, and fertilize the plant. Sometimes they can fly off, go to a different plant, and that's where like wild hybridization comes in. So I kind of looked at that and like how I could take those processes and kind of reenact it at home and like make my own like hybrid successfully based off how it happens in nature. So yeah, the biggest point of interest for my research was looking at these Bulbophyllum flowers. This is another species, I'm not entirely sure what that is. And this is kind of like a scientific diagram showing them. So this figure A over here, I got a laser pointer. Figure A is a full plant. So that's showing like the roots here, leaves, bulbs, and then the flower that comes down here. Puts out flowers. That's what the full-size flower looks like. And the biggest part of my research was looking here at figure G. This is what you'd see right here on in the middle of the flower, right there. So this is that lip I was talking about that flies land on and get pushed, kind of teeter-totter down in there. This is where the stigma, anther caps are, right there. So that's the male organs. And for those of you who have never seen like a pollinated or like seed pods on a flower, they grow right down here. So this would be the center of the flower. You get pollinated or fertilized here, and then the ovaries is what they're called down here. So you get big seed pods down there, which is kind of cool. But yeah, hopefully that diagram gives you like a little bit of a visual as to like how all those flowers are put together. Here's that middle piece again, the column as it's called, with the petals and sepals pulled apart, so you can kind of see what it looks like. Let's see. So yeah, my biggest goal for my action project is to take the information that I got off of this. It was a article by, I don't know if I mentioned this already, but the National Center of Biotechnology and Information published this article on the Phalaenopsis orchids and how they reproduce. But yeah, my main goal is to be able to kind of reenact that natural process that I read so much about, and kind of apply it universally to the rest of the flowers that I have, because this, like, this particular organ right here is kind of universal throughout every orchid species. It's kind of like male and female parts. All got 'em. Might look a little different, but yeah. So I'm sure some of you might find it a little interesting or weird that an 18-year-old boy is up here doing his TED Talk on flowers. So I was going to let you guys in on a little bit of background information as to why I'm up here presenting this. That all starts back in 2nd grade when I got my first reptile as a crested eyelash gecko named Geki. Looked a lot like this guy right here. I had him for close to 9 years, and throughout that time I was constantly adding to his cage that I kept him in the tank. It started off with just like some coconut husk substrate, little bit of fake plants and just little like stick plants that you could stick up to the glass. Slowly started adding like little vines and stuff, and that kind of piqued my interest into the live plants hobby, I guess you could say. And then I eventually, a little bit down the road, talked to the owner of the Fish Connection pet store about doing a little internship with him, to where he would show me how to make like paludariums or vivariums as they're called, which is basically completely natural tank that you keep animals in. Like here's an example. This one, Bruce, the owner of the Fish Connection, actually made. That's in his store. If you guys, some of you may have seen that in the back of the Fish Connection, but taught me how to build those. So it's basically like false bottom water area, and then there's a pump that runs along the back and kind of recirculates it. All live plants, live fish, really just beautiful. I consider it art. So yeah, taught me that, and then that's really where I started getting into plants, like just in my tanks. I'm like, oh, look at this moss, that's crazy. You sit there for 30 minutes looking at one little growth of moss that's popped up. And then, like, with orchids, that's kind of just, you know, an extreme to that. They're extremely beautiful, kind of a difficult plant to grow for most, so it's, I don't know, I kind of pride myself, I guess, a little bit in how successful I am in keeping them. But yeah, so those hobbies kind of go hand in hand, the plant and animal. So I kind of got more into that, and I don't know if any of you know Oslo Mills. He was a freshman here at Animus, our freshman year. He is a good friend of mine and is super into the orchids as well. So like, he was the one who kind of sparked me in like to this orchid specific hobby. Really got me interested. Yeah, I think he's got like 100 different species or so, something ridiculous. But yeah. So, with the time I had for research, and like all, like, I don't know, I guess there were still some questions I had at the end of my research time I didn't get to answer. with the like reproductive success of the orchids, I looked at like, or kind of thought like, they produce so well with themselves. Like, is there any possibility that they could possibly be hybridized with a different plant, like something like a lily or violet, something that's not in their direct family but still somewhat related? So yeah, and then second question was, what are the positive and negative impacts that humans have on orchids? So while there are people like me, hobbyists and breeders, who are like every day out there just for fun, like making new orchids and breeding more of them just so they have a surplus of them, maintaining the population, there's also those negative environmental impacts that we have, such as deforestation and pollution. So I really wonder, like, where do we stand on that, like, kind of balance point? Do we negatively affect their species, or do we positively affect their species? So that was one thing that I would have definitely liked to look at a little bit more. Did not have the time. And then going back to the bulbophyllum plants and the fly pollination, I looked, I kind of thought, like, this is a symbiotic relationship that these two species have. So, like, clearly the orchid is dependent on the flower, but what would happen if the flower wasn't there? Like, how do orchids contribute to their ecosystem? Like, would everything collapse if we did not have them, or things go on as is? So yeah, those were kind of some of my biggest questions as far as the research went, and yeah, that's all I got. Thank you guys for coming. I hope you enjoy.
All right, we'll open it up to questions from audience and panel.
Cool.
Can you talk a little bit about what your research said, like once you sort of figured out what needs to happen to pollinate these orchids? Like, what are some of the important factors that you are going to have to consider when you actually start to breed these plants?
One thing I forgot to mention, well, like with the breeding that seems a little weird considering the fact they're pollinated by flies, is sterilization is a huge part of it. So like learning all these like parts and where they go and how they reproduce and like what happens in nature. Reenacting that like at your home, you need like a very controlled environment, and surprisingly, like you'd think with all the dirt and weird grime that bugs have on them, it wouldn't be too clean out there. But I did try one attempt at doing this and it failed just because I did not have like sterile tools or anything, and I read that was actually a huge part of it. So yeah, if that answered your question or not a little bit. Victoria, do you have a question?
Yeah, I was just wondering how many orchids species do you have personally?
I think I have close to 20 different species. Or like maybe 30 plants total. So, that's strong.
So what, I guess, like, what is the means of reproduction? Like, do orchids reproduce as seeds? Do they reproduce as, like, cloning?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, I didn't really go into depth about it, but there's the cloning, and then there's like the actual breeding. So when you do pollinate them from like flower to flower, you'll get that little seed pod that kind of pops up behind the flower. Flower drops eventually, and then the seed pod cracks open, and then I forgot to mention it, but orchids are epiphytic is what they're called. So they're not your typical plant. They don't just grow in the ground. So the seeds do grow a little differently, but they still do grow seeds. Whereas the cloning kind of comes like, you've got like this little section that you cut out of their stems, and then like an orchid kind of grows out of it.
And then once they grow the seeds, do you like take those and plant them like in whatever medium they grow in? Or
Yeah.
Okay.
So I've seen it done with like a gel paste. I don't really know exactly what it is, but like hydroponics gel or something. So. Ben?
How similar is the process of reproduction for orchids as opposed to other flowers?
So there's a couple different types of flowers. There's like perfect flowers and imperfect flowers. Orchids being a perfect flower, meaning they have both the male and the female like reproductive organs like basically set up to reproduce with themselves, and they don't like. I don't know if they need a pollinator, but like they can like things can happen. Like for example, wind could blow anther cap off and it blow into the stigma, and that would equal like reproduction. Whereas like I want to say like a sunflower, you've got the stigma is like in completely different areas of the flower as opposed to like where the anther is. So yeah, I don't know. It's kind of hard to explain it without having like a visual for it.
But the process itself is the same.
Yeah. I mean, same process for anything that's reproducing, honestly. Kyle?
You said that orchids tend to be difficult to grow.
Mm-hmm.
What makes them difficult to grow?
I think that epiphytic aspect, and so that means they don't grow in soil. They grow off, I believe the definition is a plant that gets its nutrients from other plants and air. So water is a huge thing. Like you can't overwater them, they'll rot. Can't underwater them, they'll dry out and die. Lighting is a huge thing, temperature, and a lot of it is actually just people not like thinking their orchids are dead, just because like the flowers are gone or something. They don't know that it's just not blooming right then. So I don't know. A lot of it's misconceptions, and then other of it, or most of it, is like people not really like doing the research, I guess. So yes.
Could part of it be like, and I don't actually know this, so I could be basing it off false knowledge. I associate orchids with like rainforests and like high humidity and high heat environments. Is that the case? Like, is part of why they're difficult to grow that they're not in sort of this environment that they're used to, or is that not the case?
That's actually good. Like, I didn't really think about that. Most orchids that people have in their house is a Phalaenopsis orchid, which is just, I believe, from Indonesia. So yeah, it is tropical orchid. So they like humidity. So we, like here in Colorado, is very arid, obviously. We don't have ideal growing conditions for them. But there are species that grow here in Colorado. Like some grow up at Spud Lake here. I'm pretty sure they grow all across America, different species. So, Victoria?
What do you usually grow your orchids in? Like, if not soil?
Yeah, so there's a couple different mediums I use normally, like just wood chips, like bark wood chips, or like lava rocks, kind of. So you put them in a basket of lava rocks, so there's like room for them, for the roots to kind of grow around. And they basically just kind of grab hold of all that and grab hold of the basket that you're growing them in. But most of my like favorite orchids and most successful orchids are grown in tanks. So it's a little bit more natural process. So they're mounted up onto like the back of those terrariums that I make. So that's kind of more how they grow in the wild, like off the trees and stuff. So yeah.
If I were inspired by your presentation to go buy an orchid from City Market this afternoon, what would your tips for sharing for be?
Hypothetically.
I can't give you any tips on the easiest orchid there are because I kill them all for some reason. I don't know why. Get one that has pseudobulbs. That's my best guess.
So how should I care for it following that?
Treat it like a sponge. Don't let it dry out. Like you can watch it. They get super wrinkly and they kind of turn into like little green raisins looking. Yeah, they're basically like big camel humps. That you just kind of just watch them. Yeah. See what they want. Ashley?
Can you bring them back from the dead?
No. Unfortunately.
On that note.
Another question back there.
Last question? No? All right. Thank you very much, Cairo. If you'll step outside for just a moment, please. Ashley's going to show up at your doorstep with like a dead stick.
I almost
Cairo, make
today.
it bloom.
Just put on that. Care for it.
All right, panel.
He seemed really knowledgeable about his topic. He knew about everything. Reductive wise, which I didn't. What was his question again?
How do you grow orchids, basically?
Yeah,
What
like
steps
how do you
grow
breed
orchids up?
hybrids?
Yeah.
Okay, so it was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So.
Okay. So that was on point. He definitely talked about the reproductive system of it and how to grow.
I thought the structure and format of his presentation was a little awkward. I
Mhm.
would have preferred him to go into why he was interested in it and his
Before.
personal connection first,
Mhm.
and then talk about his research,
I
and then the
agree.
future implications.
Yeah,
I thought
I
that would
agree.
have been smoother.
I think I had that exact note written down somewhere.
I was interested a little bit in what made them different. Like he described how plants reproduce. I know nothing about that, so I don't know if that's how all plants reproduce and
Yeah, that
orchids are
was
special,
interesting.
or and
Yeah.
he seemed to draw that out in questions a little bit. But I think since this was about orchids, it should have been a little more like, all right, I'm gonna tell you general flower stuff, and then this is what makes orchids unique,
Right.
and
Yeah.
then this is how, and then to transition it into, and as a orchid grower, this is how I'm gonna cope with that
Mhm.
situation, right? And he seems to know that pretty well when we ask him questions.
Yeah.
As someone who really likes plants, this was a really interesting presentation. Found it interesting. I have a little more insight on why my plants die. But I don't know, to me it seemed like he had a good grasp on what was going on.
Yeah, this was just, sorry, you can go. You got it. I was just gonna say this is slightly a tangent, but I would have been interested to see like what orchids he was growing or
Mhm.
what type of like nature's background images he made.
You should have brought one of his things.
Oh
and
my
they're
God,
so
yes.
So good.
cool.
Yeah,
They're
that would have been
beautiful.
awesome.
Ask him, he'll show you pictures on his phone.
Yeah, he
They're
will.
amazing.
We'll go on for like hours.
Yeah, it was really interesting to me with this. Like, he had so much information in here, and he had so much other information in his thesis that was not in here. I wish he would have included a little bit more, because I think it would have ran like this was awesome, and like this actually gave me a fuller picture. I think of some of the stuff he researched, but he had some other really cool stuff in his research about like the health of the parent plants and like specialized care for like seedlings and what do you do like actually after like they're grown. And so I would have loved, I think that could have just rounded it out a little bit. But yeah, I mean, he's so not like, he just has this stuff in his head because he loves it. Like his passion is so clear for this topic. I like to see that.
Yeah, as far as bringing his own in, like he had a picture earlier on, he's like, this is one, I don't really know what it is. Then either don't put it in
Right.
or don't talk about it like
Yeah.
that. Pick something that you can talk about, like have one of the, like, this is my favorite one and I read it this way, or,
Yeah.
you know, like
Yeah.
that would have, and that's a little thing, but,
Mhm.
you know.
Yeah.
I think more diagrams would have been helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
The one he had on there was helpful.
Yeah, it was, and he used it really well. Like
Yeah.
he like actively walked us
And if
through
he
it.
hadn't, it would have lost us.
Oh yeah, I don't know what any of
There's a
those
lot
words
going on
mean without the pictures. Like, wait, we call him in? Let's do it.
You and Ashley gonna form a little plant support group.
I can keep them out. The rest of them
So
alive.
don't tell me, don't tell her this, but I accidentally overwatered Katie's orchid, and I'm really worried.
Bring it to Cairo.
I will.
He's like a plant doctor.
Can we make that a condition of passing?
Yeah. Unless you can fix Katie's orchid, Cairo.
I'm gonna be in big trouble.
Roland thinks he overwatered it. So Cairo, there were a lot of strengths with this presentation. We felt like your passion and interest was super clear. Like you're comfortable talking about this, and you're
Yeah.
conversational, but you're still super knowledgeable.
Mhm.
We really liked the diagrams early on. The way that you used this picture and the way that you used this picture to really explain to us the anatomy was very, very clear. And I felt like I could sort of visualize the fly reproduction and how that worked and how all these parts fit together and why they were important. So really nice job there.
Thanks for no close-up pictures of flies too.
Yeah.
Yeah, we appreciate that. We would have liked, with regards to the visuals, it would have been awesome to see some of your orchids
Yeah.
and your work. So like you had this one right here, I think that you didn't know what it was. So don't do that. Just show us a picture of one of yours that you know what it is,
Yeah,
right?
totally.
Like this is a super minor quibble, but we
Or
would have
don't
liked to
mention
see-
that you don't know what it is.
Yeah.
Like,
Okay.
Just don't
here's-
tell us.
Here's an orchid. I'm going to show you how it works instead of like, here's an orchid. I don't really know much about this one. Now let me go into other things. Like,
Yeah,
there's no
yeah.
Yeah.
need to have said that.
Yeah. As far as organization goes, we liked all of the aspects. We would have liked your personal story first and then go into all the research. It just would have made sort of more coherent sense to us if you had talked about how you got into this and then got into like all the technical stuff next.
Totally.
and draw a distinction between the way flowers work and the way orchids work.
Okay.
Right? Because I think a lot of our questions that you saw during Q&A were like, okay, what makes orchids special? And particularly people who have experience, like, I can keep a flower alive, I can't keep an orchid alive. Why are they different?
Yeah.
So I think as you were talking about plant biology, it was new, it was interesting to me, because I know nothing about it, but making that clear distinction of like, and here's what makes orchids unique. Like the perfect flower thing, like they are actually a perfect flower, which is different in this way, which changes, and then it goes into as a hobbyist, as a grower, because it's different in this way, that's why I have to act in the ways I act to.
Yeah, I think you maybe assumed we had more knowledge than we did.
Okay.
Which, thanks, I guess. But, and then my other piece of feedback is that, like, you had a ton of stuff in here, and I felt like it was really great and thorough. I would have liked to see a little bit more of this stuff in your thesis, that where you were talking about, like, the healthy parent plants and things like that. I think could have just, like, rounded this out a little bit.
Yeah.
But again, this is minor because I felt like your presentation did sort of answer your question. So, so take that as you will.
But you did have a little bit of time left, so
you did.
you could have filled it with that. It wasn't like you were trying to cut things down.
And I think your strength came in the Q&A, where you really like,
Yeah.
you know this stuff and you know it pretty cold. And I'm looking forward to seeing what crazy flowers you create in your senior project.
Yeah.
Sweet.
How long does it take from start